This series started with the aim to produce an insight into the Janissaries and create a compact history of the core at the same time. Unavoidably, it turned into a compact history of the Ottoman Empire. The history of the Janissaries started with the precursors, an infantry unit called Yaya, during the reign of Orhan I, the son of Osman I, who basically founded the Ottoman Empire. Sultan, or in those times Beg, Orhan, had to face the problem that his forces consisted mainly of mounted raiders, who acted relatively autonomous. In order to face both problems, he decided to create a professional infantry unit, which he personally paid instead of just promising plunder. And this is how the Sultan came up with the Yayas. This happened somewhere around 1350. The Yayas are relevant for the history of the Janissaries because of the obvious attempt to create a professional infantry corps, but they also wore a white cap, which would become one of the signature accessoires of the Janissaries. Unfortunately for Orhan, the experiment with the Yayas failed in the end, because the men worked for him anyway in one way or the other, and so paying them was an expensive mistake. But the idea survived. It is likely that the first companies of a new corps were composed of captives, corralled and driven around, awaiting ransoms which were unlikely to be paid. They were not only a nuisance but also a waste of talent. Converted to the Sultan's cause, they could be valuable warriors. It was a practice which had long been followed in Islam and elsewhere. And this is how the Janissaries came about. Through this system called Penchik, Sultan Murad I did not commit to the same error as his predecessor. Instead, he dipped into a new source of manpower and changed a liability into an advantage when he made these prisoners of war into his own bodyguard. This happened in the second half of the 14th century, with 1362 being the earliest date mentioned in the sources. But soon enough, Penchik could not provide enough recruits anymore. Before 1400, Devshirme was put to use to expand recruitment. It was codified in 1402 after the Battle of Ankara. Slowly but surely, it became more commonplace in the second quarter of the 15th century. It was probably Murad II who systematized this institution around 1420. The basic idea of Devshirme was to take boys from the local population from their parents. Nobody asked them for their opinion. Depending on their intelligence and looks, they either received an exceptional education and became administrators or officers, or, more commonly, soldiers. Over the course of history, 500,000 to 2 million boys, willingly or unwillingly, had to endure this procedure. With Devshirme, the Janissaries reached their maturity, and the world was ready to test and judge them. And the world judged them graciously, although not without reason. From around 1450 until the end of the reign of Suleiman, the Janissaries helped to expand the Ottoman Empire enormously. During this expansion, the Janissaries were the fear of the whole Occident. They conquered most of the Balkans and Anatolia, as well as land up to modern-day Ukraine, parts of Iraq, Syria, Egypt, Yemen, and Algiers. With the empire, the numbers of Janissaries expanded too. The increase came in two waves. First, with the establishment of Devshirme, coinciding with an expansion into the Balkans. This institution lasted for 100 years until the numbers tripled again. The second wave had a very peculiar background story. One could make a point that, omitting external factors like changes in tactics, this was due to Suleiman's inability to make a clear decision on his successor. In the end, a civil war between his sons Selim and Bayezid ensued. During the dynastic struggles of the Ottoman princes under Bayezid II and Suleiman I, the prince, who was unable to secure the support of the reigning sultan and the central standing troops, recruited thousands of landless peasants, townsfolk, nomads and vagrant irregular soldiers. Referred to as daily wagers after the salary, these militiamen were ordinary tax-paying subjects. So a big number of peasant soldiers flooded into the military and administrative institutions of the empire. Soldiers from the losing side roamed the country as bandits. Selim II had a hard time to pay his soldiers, so he gave them other goodies, like allowing the Janissaries' sons into the corps in 1568 and legalizing marriage for enlisted men. In 1582 all restrictions were lifted. Anyone who wanted could now enter the corps. This explains the recruitment side of the second expansion of the Janissaries' numbers. At the same time, from a military point of view, the soldiers were needed to fight the bandits mentioned before, face ever stronger enemies, and garrison the vast empire. In addition, there were economic problems. Some of them were external, some due military problems, and others were homegrown. Let's list them. First, the Ottomans lost the control over the major trade routes to the east in the 16th century to the Portuguese in the south and the Russians in the north. The central route got blocked by continuous wars against Persia. This robbed the Ottomans of the possibility to counterbalance deficits with taxes on trade. Second, the overblown military apparatus devoured more and more of the empire's resources. In this time, military apparatus describes mainly the Janissaries, since the provincial troops lost their importance and Janissaries took over the roles. Third, a lot of military conflicts put pressure on the empire towards and after the turn to the 17th century. At the same time, advances in weapon technologies made the training of soldiers easier. This had the effect that the average age of boys recruited through Nizam-i increased by 3 years. Instead of receiving a training over many years, the boys were picked up, got a musket, learned how to use them, and were sent into the meat grinder. Fourth, inflation hit the whole continent because of all the gold and silver imported from the European nations' new colonies, primarily in the Americas. But the main problem was not even the imported expansion of the money supply. Whenever the Ottomans had problems with the budget, they debased the currency, which means that the coins now had a worse fineness. It turns out that a lot of the price inflation in the empire was due to the homemade debasement. Debasement, constraints on the budget, and an inability to shrink the army left only one option. At the turn from the 16th to the 17th century, the Janissaries, an elite corps of professionals drafted through Nizam-i, turned into something that can only be described as a militia of artisans, craftsmen, traders, and petty shopkeepers. This new kind of Janissaries spent most of their time on earning their living and only turned to soldiering when needed. The Janissaries Maturity was their time of success. The Janissaries fought many battles and most of the time they were successful. In my analysis, I counted 10 major victories and only 3 decisive defeats. This is not a big surprise, considering the vast expansion of the empire in the same time period. When the corps opened up recruitment to everyone and the former soldiers became traders acting as militiamen, their role in the empire changed dramatically, ultimately leading to the corps' decline. The Janissaries as musket-bearing infantry became more and more important from a military point of view, but the deployment only made sense in masses. At the same time, the traditional Ottoman cavalry archers, the Sipahis, lost nearly every value. The Janissaries took over their roles, also in civilian life. The Janissaries developed from elite soldiers into tradesmen serving only when needed. The days when they earned a living through plunders from conquests were over. Instead, they now did honest work as petty shopkeepers, unskilled laborers, but also high-skilled artisans who became influential with the guilds. For this income, they had tax exemptions because of the status as Janissaries. Additionally, they also received a small payment for being soldiers, rations, pensions, and on certain occasions gifts from the Sultan. Higher-ranking Janissaries were another case. They had the chance to become farmer generals. The task was to provide easy money and credit to the government, while extracting everything they could from the farms in the time they had bought the rights to the area. So, on the one hand, we have the enlisted men. They provided the manpower for warfare and received welfare in return. A welfare-warfare state, so to say. On the other hand, there were the officers. Just like the Sipahis before them, they managed military and agricultural affairs for the government. A military-agricultural complex, if you will. Together, enlisted men and officers became an interest group combining the military with the lower and middle economic classes. Thereby, around 1600, they created a network, which I call the Ottoman Deep State. This deep state expanded over the next century. With it, the size of the Janissary Corps grew too. From 1700 to 1800, the numbers of the Janissaries rose and fell on a regular basis. Sometimes there even was an immense volatility from one year to another. During both centuries, revolts became more and more prominent, while at the same time the Janissaries turned into a failure from a military point of view. In the 17th century, the Janissaries revolted repeatedly, lost most important battles, and only managed to win a handful. The 18th century presents us with the same picture, maybe it got even worse. Before 1600, the Ottomans and therefore the Janissaries went from victory to victory. They lost only some major or decisive battles. Keeping this in mind, one might even forgive the rebellions. I found 6 instances of rebellions in the literature. After 1600, important victories became rarer and rarer. At the same time, the density of major revolts increased. I counted 4 major victories, 13 decisive defeats and 9 revolts, which is much worse than what happened in the 2 centuries before that. Interestingly, this means that until 1800 we have around the same number of victories, defeats and revolts. Putting both defeats and revolts on the negative side, this is disastrous. Of course, there were attempts to reform the court too. The most prominent instance was the Köprülü era. This family of Grand Viziers tried to reform the empire in the second half of the 17th century and even tried to abolish the Janissaries, but in the end they failed. Revolts by the Janissaries were a real threat to the reigning sultan. They deposed no less than 7 of them. Mustafa I even experienced it twice. Osman II and Ibrahim I were the unfortunate ones who died during such revolutions. They did not exactly die by the hands of the Janissaries, but in both cases it definitely was what the core wanted. Aside from sultans, the Janissaries also killed many a Grand Vizier and uncountable other administrators. On top of that, the Janissaries grew used to plundering Istanbul. After the turn to the 19th century, the Janissaries added another victim, Selim III. He tried to modernize the military by creating the New Order, a new army formation built after European standards. The Janissaries were not willing to allow a rival and in 1806 massacred the men of the new troops. Selim III died when the Janissaries looked for a new sultan. After the struggle, Mahmud II became the new sultan, since he was the only heir left. He kept still for a while, but in the long run had the aim to continue Selim's reforms. In 1826 he was ready and provoked a revolt. The Janissaries fell for the trap. On the night of the 14th to the 15th June 1826, the Janissaries gathered, turned over the cauldron and cut off the Topkapi from the outside. But Mahmud was prepared, and artillery, the most elite and loyal branch of arms, moved in. Soon they clashed with the Janissaries. At the Horho fountain, Ibrahim Aga came face to face with a company of Janissaries. He had the guns manned and attacked at once. Although 2 artillerymen were killed, one burst of grape shot had the rebels retreating post-haste to the Ed Maidan, where the comrades rallied and, entering the barracks, closed the great door. The Janissaries retreated to the barracks, but artillery devastated the building, and hundreds of Janissaries died either in the ensuing fire or at the hands of the artillerymen. A cleansing followed, first in Istanbul, then in the rest of the empire. In the end, thousands of Janissaries were killed or exiled. 2 years after these events, some of the last Janissaries died fighting, although not against the Sultan, but against the Russians at Akhalchik in 1828. There are different point of views regarding the auspicious event. The older literature claims that the Sultan took back control over the empire, which was his by right. New publications look at the Janissaries as an institution which defended the population's interest against the Sultan and died as martyrs for this purpose. Personally, I see all the revolts which accumulated in the auspicious event as a fight between 2 institutions, the Sultan and the Janissaries, over the control of the state. Whichever of them was in power could use the empire's resources for his purpose. There was no objective good or evil involved. The auspicious event rid the Sultan of the Janissaries, but it did definitely not save the empire. In comparison to the major European countries, it remained a second-rate power until the once so glorious Ottoman Empire followed the Janissaries into the graveyard of history after the defeat in the First World War. And this is where our compact history of the Janissaries, and therefore the whole series on the Janissaries, ends. I hope you learned something, certainly I did. I learned that an exceptional institution over time could get extremely powerful until it does not serve its intended purpose anymore. It is dangerous to generalize such a development, but at least it should be a warning to us. I also learned that there is a lot one can demand of people without arousing their resistance. They will even give up their children if the threat is big enough. Nizam-i is the extreme example. I also learned that, on an institutional level, power does not necessarily lie in the guns, but originates mostly in people's brains. The Sultan on his own is an unimportant weak individual, but his dynasty was an institution invoking religious-like beliefs. In the end, the weapon-handling Janissaries had no chance of getting rid of the dynasty. But there also are things which I did not learn. I was unable to answer my main question, that is why the once so glorious Ottoman Empire lost its dominance and fell back light years behind the rising European nations. Of course, everything fails and declines at some point, but at least a hint on an answer would be useful. Luckily, I have developed some possible starting points for an explanation. It could be that what the empire did was relatively unimportant, and external influences were just too big. I'm referring here to the influx of precious metals from the Americas, which might have resulted in a wealth transfer from the east to the west. Nevertheless, this leaves the question open why it was the Europeans who managed to open this source of income first. It could also be that something in Ottoman culture or the culture of the opponents changed, so that the Ottomans ended in a position of relative weakness. To develop the thought further, I would not only need to understand the culture of countries like today's Turkey, but also the culture prevalent in the times we studied. I fear this is beyond my abilities. Then there is another explanation attempted by Barkan. Inflation, the century's economic illness, contaminated all with the sickness of unlimited spending, not least the bureaucrats, both high and low, who were able to make illicit gains by exploiting the public charge. The habits of petty bribery, intrigue and the selling of public office were widespread, and they became the causes of the downfall of the imperial administration. This degeneration of governmental morality caused an enormous squandering of government funds, bringing the state to a financial and political crisis. I know that the disastrous results of inflation can hardly be overstated. At least in this point we should learn from the past. Nevertheless, Europe experienced inflation too. This surely is a topic I will read more about. Whatever the reasons for the decline of the empire were, I am sure it was not due to the Janissaries. Their failures were merely a symptom of a bigger problem. Maybe you can find another explanation by watching the more detailed documentation series on the Janissaries. I could not have done this short video without doing the whole series. I will link to the playlist at the end. Make sure to watch it and tell me in the comments about your findings. I do not know if anyone is going to experience my production as worth watching. If this should be the case, I'm happy to be of service and hope you learned something too. I appreciate every one of you. So long. Stay critical, stay curious, stay free.